You've been hearing a tale of many changes. We are in a moment of change in LABRI. Thank you. This is to remind me that I can't go on all night. I am finite. You are finite. We're limited by time. I'm going to try to squash into a few minutes the fact or facts surrounding the change that we have made in having our residential portion of LABRI be in Rochester, Minnesota, rather than Chalet Les Malaises. After 36 years in Switzerland, it's a bit hard for me to say to people when they say, "Where do you come from? Where do you live?" Just these last few days, it's been hard to say, I live in Rochester, Minnesota. I always have to preface it by saying, well, I've lived for 36 years in Switzerland, but because I feel so very much that Switzerland is my home. Changes come in life. It's a fact of life. It's a fact that we need to remember in a family. You don't keep a baby forever. You don't keep a 2-year-old forever. In our own family, our grandchildren are coming to the age, some of them, where they are departing from home. As Susan and Ranald leave Gretham, which Richard just showed to you on the screen, and go to Switzerland, they'll only be coming with 2 of their children, because Margaret will be being married, Lord willing, in July, and her future home will be in the very top of the mountains of Nepal, as she'll be going out there as a missionary with her anthropologist husband-to-be. And Kirsty will be staying in England to be going to college, continuing in college there. Becky, our granddaughter who is married, will be here tomorrow, I think, with her husband from Georgia. So she no longer lives in Chalet Tzino with her mother and father. Has been a time since she's lived there, but she and her husband were working in LABRI for a time. Families don't stay frozen in one state, nor does the work that has been a family kind of work. We are a family in LABRI. A lot of you are a part of the wider LABRI family. As my husband and I have been with Frankie for the last few weeks doing seminars in a number of different colleges, 11 different colleges, we've been astounded again by the root system that God has formed. Or putting it in another way, the family, the scattered family of LABRI, and of how people quietly or noisily are changing things in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. Udo has just come back from Africa. I don't want to steal his thunder, but he did meet and spend time with someone who had been in LABRI in his chalet with him and with Debbie way back in the 60s. What was it? 69, Duncan from Bulgaria, an African from Kenya, and he met him in Kenya just recently. I know that as Anki Rukmacher goes to India and to Kenya, she meets people that have been in LABRI. So we are here gathered at this moment to be together in a very special way. It won't be repeated, not this blending together. This will not be repeated. This is a precious time for each of you and for us. God has something for us in this period of time. This moment of history is to affect future history in whatever place you come from, in your family life, in your own personal life. This is an important moment of history for you. And we have heard something of what has been taking place in LABRI in the past, and in each of the branches. I would speak to you of our being in Rochester as that which is not a sudden thing of a kind of bizarre decision in the middle of nowhere. It is that which has been prepared for by God in an amazing way. How was LABRI prepared for in the first place? We speak of 30 years, 29 years of LABRI. Well, it was, if you go back to the beginning and read the LABRI story, it was a little boy having polio, a girl having rheumatic fever, floods and avalanches, which this country knows a lot about in different forms in this last week. Floods and avalanches hitting our village, are being put out of Champery on the 14th of February, 1955. What a strange beginning for a work. A flood of afflictions. Out of this, and I'm not about to tell you the whole story of LABRI again, but out of this came that which has affected so many people. Everybody on this platform has been affected, myself included, but each person, each worker that works in LABRI now has been affected some way through history by coming into LABRI. And then to jump to 1984. What has that got to do with 1955? Well, astoundingly enough, my husband became 72 years old in 1984. And as we count the years, he has lived in Switzerland 36 years, one half of his life. And now, bang, there is a new, what? A new beginning. For how long? I don't know. None of us know how long a period that is beginning is going to last. But 6 years ago, when the Whatever Happened to the Human Race film was finished, and you will see some of those episodes if you go to see the episodes at lunchtime. Just as that film was being finished, the 4th episode was ending, and that was the last episode to be made. The 5th had been made in Israel just very shortly before that. But as it was being finished, we discovered there was a need, as I ran over to Udo and Debbie's chalet, Johnsiana, to telephone Mayo Clinic. I didn't even know where Mayo Clinic was. I didn't know I was telephoning Minnesota, really. I wasn't up on where Rochester was. I thought it was New York. Lots of people make that mistake. All right, with that lack of knowing where Mayo Clinic was or where Rochester was, I made that first phone call, which was to take us a few days later into finding out that my husband had cancer. Now, I've written in The Tapestry, the end of that book, Cancer, an Ending or a New Beginning. I had no idea, even when I wrote that chapter, how much of a new beginning it was. I never dreamt that we would be living permanently in Rochester 6 years later, after going there that October day. At this time, flowing out of our going to Rochester, October 1978, flowing out of that, there has been a branch of LABRI that has been there for 5 years. That branch has consisted of 3 houses. One is Anne Brown's house. Anne Brown is at this conference. And then the 2 others belong to LABRI. I'll jump into the present moment of arriving in Rochester on the 7th of December, 1984, having thought on Thanksgiving Day that we were approaching normal life for 2 months until we would be coming here for the conference, normal life for 3 months in that LABRI, not knowing that I would be standing here at the conference saying, I represent Rochester LABRI. I thought I'd come here from Switzerland. But that December 7th night, as we made a very traumatic dash, and I'll be telling you more about it perhaps before the conference is over, from Eagle Hospital by ambulance and plane and ambulance again to Rochester. That night, we were leaving the Swiss LABRI as workers at Swiss LABRI, not knowing it. I did not know that I had put my last table decoration on the Chalet Le Chardonnay table where some of you have eaten with us. I didn't know it was the last. You don't know what is the last of anything. The marvelous thing of having God as our Father and our guide and our director and our counselor and our friend and our rock and our hiding place and all the other things He is to us is that in the midst of all the huge and sudden changes in life, He goes before us and He is with us and He doesn't leave us nor forsake us. I come to you to say that I am representing Rochester LABRI. When did we make the decision? Well, I'll tell you more about it another time, but it is something that I want to weave together with how do you know? How do you know? How does the Lord confirm? And it's one thing after another that brings the confirmation that He is leading to another step in life, to another portion of LABRI life, to another step in what He would have LABRI used for. Rochester LABRI now has a fourth house. It is our personal house, but it's a part of the LABRI. It's 1 block away from the other houses. It's 1 block from the emergency entrance to the hospital. It's on a corner, surrounded by a fence, and already we've had students for a high tea on a Sunday night, but we've only lived in it 5 actual days before coming on this trip. And the furniture that I went back to Switzerland to pack into boxes along with some professional packers arrived, all 269 boxes, 2 days ago. No, I wasn't there. It arrived with Mike there. Who's in the LABRI now? Well, there's Mike Sugimoto, who's there for a portion of time at any rate, and Anne, and an Australian girl who has worked in Waymo, Julia, and Mary Jane and Greg Grooms, who are busy day and night with people coming and people asking for speaking and so on. Doctors are waiting for us to have our fireside ready for them to come and sit beside as they want to come and discuss. There are students who come there to study, 6 at a time. There'll be more space, perhaps, as time goes on for them to study, and there are endless invitations to come and speak at schools, colleges, beginning of Christian schools, and to nurses groups and doctors groups and so forth. And there will be a LABRI conference there, Lord willing, within another year. This is the Rochester report, and I'd better... Oh, I didn't look at the watch, but I think it did the right thing. 10 minutes.
Thank you, that's great. Just before we show you the film, let me just add one thing. Dick mentioned that at LABRI, part of the whole situation there is that we really, often we sit around meals talking about things. We want to be available to you as individuals. We don't want to just come up here and say our piece in our lectures and then run away. But do come and ask us if you want to speak to us. Obviously, we can't speak to everyone, but we do want to be available to talk with you personally. In between, we can set up times with you. So do come and speak to us about that if you want to. Because at LABRI, it is very much coming to join our families. You're not coming there to a college or to an institution. It is very much living with us as families. And we can't do that here so much, but we do want to be with you as people and be available to you. This film is part of the series called Reclaiming the World, 10-part series. And the last one is where Dr. and Mrs. Schaeffer talking with Frankie, their son, about how the Lord led them to LABRI. And then hopefully Dr. Schaeffer will be here too and Dr. Mrs. Schaeffer can answer any questions that you have.
Our change came about because of my husband's need to be near that Mayo Clinic for a longer period of time. He has gone through 4 months of one thing after another. It has been a battle, and again, I want to talk more about that later in context of Scripture, of the whole thing of how Satan tempts us and how Satan attacks us, and the reality of the battle. But I would say that, excuse me, coming from these seminars in 11 different colleges and seeing the response and being a part of what has taken place in discussing with people afterwards and so on, I realized why Satan would try to stop my husband's mouth before he finished the book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, which he finished in the hospital, and before he had a chance to answer questions as we went with Frankie for the showing of his film, which you'll be seeing later. It's a satirical film. It's very strong in saying what is wrong or stirring us up, throwing ice on us to awaken us as to the rapidity with which things are moving if we who are Christians do not act and take action in the midst of the problems of today, the issues, the social issues of today. Are Christians to be doing something? We believe so very thoroughly. I think that the succession of illnesses seems to me were a part of a design to keep or to stop forever my husband's mouth, to keep it shut for a period of time or to stop it forever. Whatever, we've gone through a change of the form of cancer, 2 very differing infections, totally apart from the cancer. The cancer now is large cell lymphoma instead of small cell. He's undertaking or going through chemotherapy for that, which is very, very harsh, and which lots of people do not respond to, but he has responded. There has been a major operation. There has been the need to put in a Hickman catheter, which the first one went wrong. I mean, it didn't work. And a second one had to be put in several weeks later. He's gone through staph infection, which the doctors said, now that's it. He can't go on the seminar tours or do this conference. Have we come in defiance to the doctors? No, not at all. The doctors changed before our time was up there. In the last 4 days, they changed their pronouncements. So I do believe our being here is a victory. There has been a battle. Does that mean the battle is over forevermore? No. Have you found the film? All right, I'll leave. You'll hear more of this later. This is just parenthesis. It will be enlarged upon. All right.
I'm sorry about that. There are a number of films up there, and there are several episode 10s. We will probably be on the program we had finishing around 9. I think most evenings we'll probably finish somewhere around 9:30, 9:45. Tonight probably between 9 and 10 somewhere. Okay, those of you who have to leave, fine. Maybe you should sit somewhere near the door if you need to get out.
Back in 1954, when you both began the work of LABRI, what was the basic motivation for what you did then?
You must see that the essence of LABRI, born out of that moment, was a desire in Mother's and my mind to demonstrate that God existed. That's really the heart of the whole thing. And it was in that specific historic situation that we found ourselves, in contrast to what we had seen. We moved ahead one step at a time. And we called the children together, including yourself, in Chalet-Bijou and Champery, because we realized that was on the... We were involving our children in something that from a naturalistic sense was fatal. So we called the children into Chalet-Bijou in the living room there, including you, and we explained the alternatives. To write to the most people we could think of, to raise money in the normal way, to lay out a plan for the future, or simply to look to God in answer to prayer that He would show us. And then we had a vote. I wish I had a picture of it now, though it's very, very firmly fixed on my mind. And it was unanimous that we would step out to tell God that we knew He was there in such a way that we could trust Him. Not theoretically, but in that hard situation in the totality of life. And to that end, we felt called, and I must always say now, looking back on, we're not laying this down as a more spiritual formula for anybody else, but it was our calling, but remember, not our calling abstractly, but on the basis of my wrestling of the truth of God being there. So it was very much in a tight circle. And we felt called to say that we would not ever try to have money if we needed money, which we did. But we wouldn't ask for it, we would pray for it. And LABRI has tried to live by that principle.
Although now it's become, at this point in history, as you know, it's become more known. So now it would be more obscure. So the real acid test was back there when nobody knew anything about you. I'm not saying that God's answering prayer less now, or that I believe He's answering prayer in LABRI's case less. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying in terms of a test, the idea of test means in front of other people that they could debate now, well, you're known, the book's on, so on. But back then, there was none of this.
There was nothing.
So at that point, you were out on a limb.
Really on the limb. The second thing was that if we ever needed helpers, and at that time it seemed, we didn't have anything for helpers. But if we ever need helpers, we would never beat the bush for them, but we would pray for the helpers. Then comes the third point. And that is, we would step out, and of course you know how the story goes. It was moving over to Champery, from Champery, Les Malaises, and so on. I won't go into that. But that we would start in that chalet of Chalet Les Malaises with you with polio, 2 girls with rheumatic fever, looking to the Lord only for financial needs, that we would step out without a plan. And that doesn't mean I deny that usually in life you should have plans. But that was our calling. But remember, for what point? Not for a spiritual thing at all, but simply to demonstrate that God was there. And that we believed it so sufficiently, we would go out on the end of the limb. So we began that way. And I must say that LABRI's been far from perfect. I would want to, but we have lived in that circle. I want to say another thing here that I think comes in, I think you would be interested, and that is what I would consider guidance at this point. As you read Mother's story, the LABRI story, and we had all those indications, very providential indications, I believe we had enough leading to take that step and move into Chalet Les Malaises. We had enough leading so we'd have been disobedient not to do it. But at the same time, if you had asked me, Mother might give you a different answer, but for me, if you had asked me at that moment, was I assured that we were understanding correctly, as that I had the certainty that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, or something else out of the Scripture, I would have said no. I didn't have that kind of certainty, but I had enough leading so that I'm sure that we, and I now as the father of the family, would have been disobedient not to step forward.
Did you start LABRI with some sort of blueprint or master plan in mind?
I had no idea what the plan was. None of us did. Then as the first students began coming, we didn't say, let us pray that students will come. I mean, it wasn't anything like that. We said, Lord, show us what you've brought us over here for. And the first Sunday that we were in Chalet Les Malaises, you probably don't remember it, but we all got food poisoning because I hadn't been able to cook. I mean, the stove wasn't working yet and so on, and we had bought some patisseries that had gone off color. So we all had food poisoning, Susan the worst of all. And,
so that was the beginning
that
of the
was
great
not,
work of LABRI.
That was not a very auspicious moment.
Do you feel that the way the Lord led you, particularly in LABRI, in terms of not asking for money and funds and that sort of thing, is a rule that other people ought to follow?
People have never listened to really what Mother and I have said, and LABRI has said very loudly. And that is, we're not saying this is a higher way, a more spiritual way, a universal way, anything, none of those words. It was our calling. And you must remember why it was our calling. We were reacting to a historic situation which included our own lives as well as other people's, and in which we wanted to demonstrate the existence of God. And we felt, we felt, I'd rather say that than we were led to at this moment. We felt this was the way we were called to do it. And somebody else can feel called in completely a different way. But, now here I think you never can put these things into words, and you can never say, here somebody crosses a line. But everybody's way ought to be in the light of the reality of the existence of God. That's universal. So if you send out a mailing list, if that's your calling, you send it out prayerfully to demonstrate the existence of God. If you do it our way, which if one way was a little bit more radical, a little bit more, not really, but a little bit, that should be to demonstrate the existence of God. Now, if somebody did what we did, but not thinking consciously in a tight, I might not think as consciously as I would, because that's the way my mind is. But anyway, not thinking consciously, this is to give you the glory. This is to show that you are there. But we're doing it as a formula. It's completely unspiritual. And it could be more unspiritual than the people who send out the mailing list and do it. It's saying, God, we want you to show that you exist. I think that is the breaking point.
Yes.
I'd like to say something in there from a different angle. I was brought up in the China Inland Mission, which is known as one of the earlier, if not earliest, but one of the earlier faith missions, living by faith sort of thing. I want to say that it was a totally different kind of work in the sense of plan than LABRI, and I would certainly not sit up and say I am more spiritual than Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor went out there with a plan. He wanted to reach every single province of China, and as a very young man, younger than you are now, he went out there with a pin to stick in every province of China. He wanted to see 2 missionaries in there. When he came back and spoke in England, he spoke to Cambridge men and Oxford men. He wanted well-trained men to go out there and to give their lives to grow pigtails and dress like the Chinese. He had a sort of pattern. They were to dress like Chinese. My father grew a pigtail. He went out there ready to go in a wheelbarrow and so on. There was a very specific plan to reach all of inland China, to do it 2 by 2, with missionaries going 2 by 2, to do it in this particular way of dressing like Chinese and so on. Now, that is nothing like LABRI, and we don't say, well, we have a better thing than... Amy Carmichael, another faith work, went to India, started her work, a specific plan to reach the temple girls and temple boys who were sold as prostitutes for the Hindu temple worship. A tremendous plan that took her dressing not only like the Indians, but darkening her face and going in very dangerous streets and so forth to get these babies under tremendously dangerous conditions, almost kidnapping them almost, and into her work, and a very specific plan of how to take care of them as they came out and so on. Not at all like LABRI saying. We sat on the side of a mountain praying, Lord, send us the people of your choice. People try to type us, saying that's an intellectual work. We did not ask for intellectuals. We would take morons when they come. And we
Sometimes
have.
done.
And the thing is, it is not a specific work as to age. We haven't said we'll take college people. They're all ages and they're all types.
Yeah.
And that's very different. But that doesn't say, well, we are more spiritual because we don't have a plan. That isn't it. It's just diversity. And if people would only let God be diverse, they won't. They want to type him. Moody gets up and he preaches and Sankey sings, and then everybody says, this is how to do it. You have
They
a
keep
fellow
repeating
preach,
it and having
and you
to
have
say.
somebody sing, and then you do it that way. And God is diverse, and there are different ways in different moments of history.
Well, God's creative.
Exactly.
He's infinite. And when we shut him up to formulas, we rob him of both his infinity and his possibility of diversity, his mother has said, and we rob him of his personality. The constant thing is to reduce him to a formula.
And taken from that, there is not a formula for doing, quotes, God's work.
Only living in the circle of the Scripture. As long as you don't go outside and do what the Scripture says is sin, there is no formula. Everybody should stand before God, and He is diverse. He leads in a multitude of different ways. And I would just say this about LABRI. Anybody who would take LABRI and use it now as a formula, and we've had people try this, that's a total failure. And more than that is the factor that LABRI might have a different leading if Christ doesn't come back and it lasts for another 50 years. It wasn't perfect. I'm proud. Everybody's proud. But there was reality there. I'm convinced of this, and I say thank you, God, for that, whatever reality there was. We went along, therefore, and we weren't seeking, and we never have sought to be far-reaching in our work. I think I can say that honestly. We simply did the job that was given us, so that way back somewhere somebody spoke about student work. We didn't even start with anything in mind about student work. We just said, here we are, send us who you will. Now it went on, and gradually it grew. There was no great propaganda. It has grown constantly from one person to telling another. That's the way it grew.
Until?
It came up, and that continued, and it spread out like a root system across the world. Not a big organization, but a root system.
And it was always on the basis of people interested in ideas, not in you as people.
I think that's true, though, of course, who can say? There's mixtures, I guess, in people's mind, but basically yes. Now then, as I gave these lectures, you must understand you can say one thing. You can say you've written 21 books in 12 years or 13 years, whatever it is now. That's a fair statement. But you also have to say it's been 5 years. And you must never forget that. They didn't come out of nowhere. So that what I did was to talk. And I talked to individuals, and the seed dropping in the ground, I was willing to on some level to talk only to the 6 or 7 or 8 and then maybe gradually 20 people that sat in front of me. And I never expected those things to be written down or recorded except in the people's mind. As a matter of fact, when the first break came in making tapes, and a man sent us a tape recorder, and we had sitting in the office up there in Les Malais, and I said, I'll never use it. It's a bit humorous now. I said, I'll never use tape, because if I enter tape recording into these discussions on Saturday night and other times, it will spoil the spontaneity. They will be afraid to ask their questions. So the tape recorder sat there, I guess, 6 months. And then finally we were having a bang-up discussion with a lot of Smith College girls who were there. It was a marvelous discussion. And one of the men who was there as a worker at that time came up and said, Edith, this is too good to lose. You serve tea, make a lot of noise serving the tea, and I'll hide the microphone in the flowers. I found instead of turning them off, that they said, we want to take this back and listen to it and give it to our friends. So suddenly I was encouraged. Go on.
Okay, then how did the book start?
Well, then we went on, and we were using the tape, and I was lecturing in the various universities. I lectured in Cambridge, Oxford, University of Freiburg in Germany, and so forth. And gradually I developed a basic lecture, which I called Speaking Historic Christianity into the 20th Century. And I would go to a university, give it, not only universities, but other places. I don't know how many times I gave the lecture, listened to the answers, corrected it, strengthened it, fixed it where it was weak, and gradually built up into something very strong. And then I gave it at Wheaton College in Illinois. And when I gave it there, the college asked if they could publish it just for their own students. And I said, well, only for your own students. And they put it out as a little book because I said, I don't want books, even yet. But when I got home and they sent me one of these and I read it, I knew I had a book. And I knew I had a responsibility to put it out as a book. And that was the first time I'd ever thought of publishing a book. So we rented another little chalet near us where I could have quiet. And I used the tapes from the various university lectures that we had made, plus this book from Wheaton College, and gradually enlarged, and that became The God Who Was There. And from then on, the books just took off, and the Lord used them in such a wide way that it just became very natural to be a part of my life.
Mom, how did you get going on your books? What happened? Was there nobody stuck a microphone in?
No, nobody snuck a microphone in, but I had been telling the LABRI story up to the point where we were, day after day in the kitchen to people who would come, and in the garden when we would be weeding the garden and so on. And I thought I would never be able to keep telling that story. So there was a desire to have it in a form that I didn't have to keep retelling. Also, my daughters were telling the story when people would say, how did this work start? There was that need to have it written down, but I never expected to write it into a book. And the remark of the secular publishers, which one of those secular publishers has in recent years been asking me for a book, but this particularly large secular publishing house said that it had caught the interest of several of the editors who had read it, but that after all, nothing really happened in that book because, and he said with a rather, a sneer, his lip went up in a sneer. This was in New York City on a particular floor of this publishing house. Divine providence seems to have fixed up everything just before it happened. In other words, you didn't die of polio. We weren't actually, we were able to stay in Switzerland when we were put out. The avalanches did not demolish our house. All the things that happened, every place where there was an answer to prayer, he said nothing happened.
And you tried Christian publishers.
Yes, I did, but I'd like to say that my reply to him was this. I'd like to ask you one thing. If you could possibly conceive of there being a God, and if you could possibly conceive of it being possible to communicate with him and to make a request of him, and if you could again conceive of his replying to that request and acting into history, I'd just like to ask you something from a writer's viewpoint. How would you write it to make it seem as though something had happened?
So you had the last word.
And with that, he turned down the hall and slammed the door. There were no more words.
What about the Christian counterparts? Didn't they want you to, in a sense, weren't they critical too at first?
Yes,
some of them?
to shorten, the request was to shorten the book into a book on prayer, yes.
In other words,
quite right. The story was the actual sentence that was said by one person was, nobody, it's very strange now, nobody would ever want to read this book except someone who had been at LABRI. And if you could know of the hard-bitten Army colonels who have read that book in Vietnam and have written to me about it changing their lives, who had never been in LABRI, of long-haired druggies who had left Harvard and were sleeping in a youth hostel when some copy had been left there and read it for the first time there, who had never heard of LABRI. Such people as that who have been brought to an interest in whether God existed or not through reading this book.
Well, if Christian publishers had a better idea of what good books were, they wouldn't publish so much rubbish.
I think I'd have to answer. In my case, it wasn't that they wanted to doll it up with Bible verses, but the Christian editor of a company that we presented the book to said that nobody's going to want to read this book.
Which book was that?
The God Who Was There.
So, Mummy, you were talking about LABRI, and you're talking about The God Who Was There.
That's right. Nobody will want to read this book because only Christians who would be interested in philosophy would be interested in this book, and there aren't many of those, so there won't be any audience for it. And as a matter of fact, it's rather humorous now, that he would not publish that book until a Christian was willing to cover it with so many pounds, I forget how many, 500 pounds, for fear because he was afraid to lose money, which is a joke, because this man never had to give his 500 pounds, and this publisher, incidentally, has made an awful lot of money off of it.
And that was a British publisher.
They said the trouble is that, a second problem, is that we don't know who the audience is. Are you writing to the Christians or the non-Christians? And I was convinced from my lectures and discussions that it was possible to present material that would speak to both. And I was so determined I wasn't going to make changes. I was just sure from experience. And why not? So therefore, the God Was There, if you think of it, and all the other books, is directed simultaneously to two audiences. To help the non-Christian really realize that Christianity is something rich and not poor and worth listening to, and give the answers, but to pull the Christian into a richer comprehension of the richness of Christianity and the fullness of life. And if you think of my books, all of them have been written in this thing, and I think what my books have proved is that the editor was wrong, that you can direct a book to both audiences, and if it is written properly, that both audiences will listen. I think that's an important thing all the way down to our films. I would say, it seems to be aside for a moment, but I don't think it is. I think that most people in education or parents mistake the fact that their own children are not capable of thinking higher than they are. If you'll think of the way we've taught you, worked in our home, we always talked in a place where you had to take a step up, and you were capable of it. Now, I think, of course, people have different levels, but I think our educational system tends to do that, and our Christian educational system does it, and the publishers do it, and the preachers do it, and the whole thing. The simple fact is that a lot of people have the capabilities of thinking higher than they're giving the chance to, and if they're only given the chance to, they'll rise to it. And not only that, we must remember this, and this is very crucial to me. We've been talking about the fact that I've worked among farmers and shipyard workers and so on. I am convinced of this completely, that all people have the same basic questions, but they don't know how to articulate them. And I'm convinced that I could take the basic things that I teach now to the university students, and it isn't only university students, but to the university students, I could go back to my shipyard workers, and by shifting gears in language, only language.
Just vocabulary.
Just vocabulary. Consciously shifting it. They would understand me and they'd be interested in the questions. And I think this is where education in general, but Christian education especially, has made a terrible mistake. And after all, Christianity does touch the fullness of life. It is rich. It's not poor. It's not something that we have to be ashamed of if it's truth. What we have, I think, we mustn't be snob now. That's the next step. We mustn't be snob. But we have the responsibility of not only helping people become Christian in conversion, but we have a responsibility as a Christian responsibility to lift them up in every area of life. And that means that it ought to be the Christian who is being lifted up into the area of comprehension of art with a capital A, into all these other areas, the beauty of nature, everything you can think of. Then we must realize, beyond that, that after we have done this, it isn't just an abstract task, because now our Christians, and here I think is a very crucial point, our Christians, and especially our young people, will not be behind, they'll be ahead. Now that's crucial.